My grandparents were of Croatian descent, and I had watched the war in Bosnia and the war in Croatia through the early 90s and felt that at some point in time I would just be going there. Didn't know how or when, but this was the opportunity. My first impression once I finally got to Bosnia was mixed. I mean, we had not been given much training through this private corporation who had hired us. We had spent a week in Fort Worth, Texas, training on some very basic things. And so for me to arrive in this foreign country, which had just gone through a massive war and genocide, was really quite astounding. I learned so much every day just by seeing and looking at people and looking at the countryside, that was an education in itself. The mandate, though, was to really, try and rebuild some type of democracy and rebuild institutions within the country through the United Nations. And so I then applied to be an investigator, a human rights investigator, so I could best help with that. And that's how I started my, I guess, 2-year career doing human rights investigations there. After 10 years on the police department in Lincoln, Nebraska, I really felt that there was a lot of limitations for upward movement. I had done well and passed the sergeant's exam, but there were very limited positions open. And then I also wanted to travel the world, and I decided that this was the best way to do it. This flyer came along advertising for international police monitors. I thought that would be an interesting thing to do, both build my resume and also make some really good money because my kids were preparing to go to college. One was already in college and my last 2 were graduating high school, and thought that I needed the extra money. I was divorced, a single mom, and thought this would be a good way to go and help out with that as well. My thoughts about this company not being completely what it was advertising itself to be started before I left the United States during the recruitment process. And then once I got hired by this company and spent a week in Fort Worth, Texas at a training program they gave, it became a bit more noticeable because at that time one gentleman came in and announced that he knew where to find really nice 12 to 15-year-olds once we got to Bosnia. So that particular statement stuck in my mind. I tried to bury it, thinking that I had misunderstood. But once I got to Bosnia and discovered the number of brothels and the type of activity that was actually going on within the country, with all internationals, not just DynCorp and the US citizens, but many, many countries, it became quite clear that this was a huge organized crime and very active. This type of human trafficking for sexual and forced prostitution occurs in most mission areas around the world and all over the world. And it really starts with young women and girls who are coming from very poor, economically drained countries or who are rebuilding and gone through wars. And they're brought in to serve clientele in other countries which are rebuilding. And so goes the flow of the money, and so goes the flow of the internationals. So basically in Bosnia, all the internationals, there was an influx of internationals, an influx of huge amounts of money, and then an influx of organized crime to support these trades. This was something that had been growing for several years, but the fact that internationals and members of the international community were actually involved in participating and facilitating the use of trafficking victims was something that they didn't want to hear. And that's the part that got me in trouble when I started investigating those things. We had a group of human rights investigators who were investigating these things. I was the head of the gender office, working out of the Sarajevo UN building. And I oversaw all the investigators in the field for all these type of human rights investigations that involved women and children and sex offenses and human trafficking, domestic violence. So I was not the only one who was discovering that internationals were involved, but I happened to be the one who took on the responsibility to report their involvement to heads of the mission and to corporate management of DynCorp. I really didn't have an idea from the beginning how many of these individuals were actually involved and to what extent they were involved. So for me, it was a matter of interviewing many victims. I interviewed about 90 to 100 victims within a 6-month period, actually, who came through my office at UN headquarters. And it was always the same story over and over again, but many of them were implicating soldiers, internationals, uniforms from all different international countries, civilians, all who had plenty of cash, who were flush with cash. So for me, that didn't exactly mean local people who were quite poor. So it had to be organized crime, it had to be people with money. And we certainly had photographs of people who were stupid enough to take their pictures with some of these girls and keep it on their persons and give them back to the girls. Polaroids. We had jewelry identifications, we had tattoo identifications, we had uniforms. So really a simple investigative process would have been able to probably implicate a lot of people had those investigations been allowed to continue. The problem was the investigations were not allowed to continue once an international was implicated in the investigation. Many times those individuals were simply, if they could be identified or if they were named or positively identified, they were removed from the mission, sent back to their home country, and that was the end of the story. The victims were either repatriated or lost, and no further investigation could be done. Once those cases were leaving my office, hoping that they would be acted on appropriately by people above my level, it turned out they weren't. They were either being thrown away, the investigations were being pulled from the offices, and basically the blind eye was being turned to any involvement by internationals. Definitely orders came directly from the top on some of these cases. One case in particular, Jacques-Paul Klein had reviewed. He was the head of our mission, and a yellow sticky note came back with the file to my office saying this had been handled 2 weeks ago, disregard, with his initials on it. So clearly he was made aware of several cases and several investigations, and he basically wanted those investigations to end. And the worst part was that along with this yellow sticky note were no written instructions as to how this had been handled, whether any disciplinary action had taken place. This particular case was of a civilian UN employee driving a diplomatic plated vehicle to a brothel requesting women to come back and party. And a local citizen had taken the license plate down and gotten an identification of the driver and had complained to the local police, who in turn had turned it over to the international police to investigate. So this was just one specific incident that indicated, number one, this would have been very easy to follow up on and find out who that person was, but clearly the head of the mission didn't want that done, so we'll never know. Jacques-Paul Klein was willing to cover things up. He was willing to go on international BBC television and lie and say that there wasn't a problem in his mission, when clearly he knew there was. He knew that he had spoken to many officers within the mission who were telling him there were problems. He was privy to UN reports and documents that were going back to our US State Department. He was an American, so he knew the score. So to me, that goes to the highest levels that knew. Within DynCorp and the corporation that I worked for, the same. The highest levels within DynCorp up to the State Department knew what was going on. They were getting, in fact, the WikiLeaks had some of those actual documents leaked as well, which incredibly brings more credibility even to the stories that I was trying to get out at that time, that the State Department, the UN, were all involved in this. They knew about the men involved. They were sending them home. But they weren't doing anything more about it. So that really crushed me, I think. Fortunately, I kept copies of case numbers, copies of the basic reports that I had turned over, and those are really what I used to make my case when this finally did go to court, when I was ultimately terminated. I had to sue DynCorp in the United Kingdom because ultimately they terminated me for what they claimed was falsifying timesheets. I didn't do that, so that was proven to be wrong, and the tribunal, after hearing all the evidence in several days of court hearings, clearly came to the unanimous decision that DynCorp was lying. And so I was able to win a small settlement and gain, at least my credibility back as a police officer. However, at that point in time, it was really too late for me to do anything else in the international world. I could have, at any point in time, quit and gone back to the United States and gone back to my home police department and gone back to being an investigator or a police officer there. But that really wasn't what my goal was. My goal was to still work internationally and to continue. However, I've never been rehired by the international organizations or by the UN, and I still feel the stigma is there, that I potentially am a loose cannon, per se, or maybe cannot be trusted with what they might consider confidential information. I think it's still a big problem. I don't want to say that it's an overwhelming problem, that all employees are involved in this and all internationals, because clearly they aren't. And clearly there's a huge number of people out there who are doing the right thing and who are working toward better goals. But it only takes one or two to spoil the whole group. And of that one or two, if they're not disciplined appropriately or if they're not prosecuted, if that should be the case, then that's what causes the problems and ruins the credibility of them all. And I have to really stress this, that I don't really believe in collective guilt. I mean, I believe in individual accountability. And I think that, unfortunately, when corporations don't go after individuals who are responsible and make what's the word I'm looking for, an example, out of those people who are doing wrong, then that's when the collective guilt starts to build. And so, I guess earlier when you talked about goals, that's something that one of my goals would be, that more corporations would look at their own goals and what they do as a company, and the United Nations as well, and how they actually go after the individuals and what they do with them, and not just send them home or cover it up. That's just not enough, and that's not going to be enough ever. Whistleblowing is a bit of a derogatory term, I think, and I think it negates what you're really trying to do, which is call attention to illegal activity, not necessarily what you might consider immoral or wrong in your opinion, but actual illegal activity. And as a citizen or as a police officer, that should be a natural response, that if you're brought up in an ethical and legal world, and of course many of these countries aren't that way, but if you're there to see that that's being transitioned, then this should be something that comes very natural to you as a person or as a law enforcement officer, and you shouldn't have to be blowing the whistle. This should be your job. There should be protocol in place, and proper steps, and of course ways that you're protected. I was drawn to this field, I think, by some kind of internal struggle or force that took me there. And when you are in the business of interviewing victims and you're in the business of correcting wrongs and trying to make rights, then that's something that just comes naturally. And so I guess I can give credit to my genes, to my parents, to my upbringing, but I don't know really where the strength came from to follow through with all this.